Thomas Ligotti asked one of the most meaningful questions ever asked by a human being. In his book, Conspiracy Against the Human Race, he asks whether life is okay. In his book, he answers that with a resounding no. Life isn't okay. But this question is important when we look at Spinoza and Schopenhauer, because Spinoza would say yes, life is okay. In fact, he would say more than that. He would say that life is wonderful, life is a blessing, it's just magnificent. And Schopenhauer would say no, life is not okay, it's full of suffering, and we die, and the whole thing is fairly unconscionable and not to be admired at all. So let me go through, as far as my understanding goes anyway, the differences between Spinoza and Schopenhauer, because there couldn't be greater differences between two people. Spinoza was a sickly man most of his life. He suffered with a lung complaint. He made it worse by grinding glass. He earned his living through making lenses, and he would very often stay in this dusty, contaminated, rented room for days at a time working on his ethics and his other works. And so he died at a fairly young age, the age of 44. Schopenhauer, on the other hand, was certainly in younger life a bit of a character. He was a bit of a womanizer. You know, the beast was fully in action in Schopenhauer. Bit of a womanizer. He had no problems taking on people who he disagreed with. I think he called Hegel a charlatan, and some other contemporary philosopher a windbag. He was fairly adept at using those kinds of terms. Now let me say what Spinoza tried to communicate. His main work was the Ethics, and the Ethics consists of 5 parts. And I'm going to be fairly brutal in my evaluation of the Ethics. I've studied it for about 4 years now. Part 1 of the Ethics is concerned with the nature of God. In my opinion, it's a wholly circular argument. He says that the essence of God, the thing that defines God, is existence. And so to a large extent, if you replace the word existence for the word God, if you replace the word God with the word existence, you more or less get the gist of what he's talking about in part 1. And all the endless references to God that seem to mean nothing suddenly mean something. So I've got here proposition 14 in part 1. It's just a random one that I've come across. And he says in his proof, as God is a being absolutely infinite. Well, you know, what the hell does that mean? What does absolutely infinite mean? So if we said as existence is absolutely infinite, it kind of makes a bit more sense. And you could replace the word God by the word existence in more or less the whole of part 1. And so in a sense Spinoza is saying nothing. So proposition 15, whatsoever is in God, and without God nothing can be or be conceived. But if we said instead whatever is in existence, and without existence nothing can be or be conceived, the whole thing makes a little bit more sense, but in essence says nothing. You have to excuse me, I've got a cold, so I'm going to be clearing my throat, but I'll try and edit most of it out. So this is part 1, a whole discussion about God, and for people who like ontology and debating the finer points of all that, then yeah, part 1 is probably a fairly nourishing feast. But I don't have any interest in ontology. I have interest in practice in the main. So all the theoretical discussion about the nature of God means almost nothing to me. And in the ethics and in Spinoza's writings, you can sensibly replace the word God by existence, because the term existence means something to us. Then we get to part 2, which in my opinion is just one of the most profound things ever written. It's about the nature and origin of the mind. And in fact, I sometimes wonder whether part 1 wasn't just Spinoza basically playing the philosophy game as he was expected to play, because the ontological proof of God and all that nonsense was fairly popular in his day. So part 2 of the ethics is concerned with the nature of the mind. And, it takes a long time to go through it all, but the whole of part 2 is really just working up to the last 3 propositions. What they say essentially is that if you want to know God, i.e. existence, then you simply have to put your attention on it. That's proposition 47. And this is what Spinoza calls his third kind of knowledge, which he refers to throughout a lot of the ethics. And you wonder what the hell he's talking about. And then in proposition 47 he tells you it is that you cognize things as actually existence. In other words, to be aware of your own existence and the existence of things. It's a little bit more subtle than that, but that's the gist of it. And then in proposition 48 he tells us that actually there is no I. You have no self. And 49 he tells us that the processing that goes on within us is essentially automatic. We affirm or deny ideas based on whether they are essentially true and meaningful for us or not. And that depends on your previous programming. So, it'll take a long time to explain all of that. And then part 3, again, an absolutely masterly treatment of the emotions. Just, if you haven't read or attempted to understand part 2 and 3 of the ethics, then you've missed out on some of the most profound wisdom ever to grace this planet. And then we get to part 4 of the ethics, which is mainly about reason. And in my opinion, Spinoza loses his way in here. He talks about reason as having no power. The emotions and the desires will always trump reason. So why the hell is he talking about it? Well, the first half of part 4, he is essentially telling us that reason has no power. And then the latter part of part 4, he's saying that reason is useful in gaining understanding, which is fair enough. But he could have said it in a much more succinct and meaningful way. And he says things like, a man of reason never contemplates death. Straight from Epicurus. And then in part 5, he spends half of part 5 talking about death. So he sort of clearly kind of contradicts himself. Part 4 could easily be read as Spinoza, a man who was not well, and who was essentially trying to convince himself that his intellectual creations were something real, gave him something to hang on to. It could easily be interpreted as that. I think it's probably more than that, but it would be easy to see it as that. And in fact, Nietzsche said of Spinoza that it was his philosophy was the philosophy of a sick man. And while I don't wholly agree with that, there is a germ of truth in it. And then we get to part 5 of the ethics, which has at the beginning a few useful exercises to deal with the emotions. And then if you remember that God is existence, then a lot of part 5 may make sense to you. And he talks about how the mind could, or parts of the mind could be immortal. Well, I don't know about that. How do we know? So, all in all, Spinoza, his Ethics, which is his main work, part 1, you could happily ignore it, just replace the word existence with God. God with existence. Part 2 is a masterwork, part 3 is a masterwork, just unbelievable wisdom. Part 4 rambles all over the place, and it sounds more like a man trying to convince himself that he has control over the situation through reason, which of course we don't. And part 5, again, it sort of rambles all over the place, and it again looks like an attempt to say that if we have what he calls adequate ideas, if we develop our reason and our understanding, that we can create something that's immortal, which personally I don't believe, but that's how he treated the whole thing. And for Spinoza, the world was okay. In fact, he gets a little bit tedious with his assertions that God is wonderful and life is wonderful and all the rest of it, and clearly it isn't. It's a question, of course, what you do with life not being okay. For Spinoza, it'd be easy to just say, well, he went into denial and created a largely fictitious entity called God, and he praised heap upon God as being infinitely wise and powerful and all these things. So let's get to Schopenhauer. Well, this is going to last an awful long time. Schopenhauer's view on the whole thing was completely different, and in my opinion, there are very, very deep insights in Schopenhauer. His masterwork was called The World as Will and Representation. Well, what does that mean? It means that your understanding of the world, or your perception of the world, is your own creation. In fact, his famous line, "The world is my representation." Your brain or your mind, and I don't want to get into the discussion of whether brain and mind are the same thing, because I don't know. But the world that you perceive is the creation of your brain or mind. You cannot argue with that. Show me something that you perceive that is not a simulation by your brain. It's all a simulation by your brain. Even the fact that your brain occupies a part of the space that it simulates is a reality. Read Metzinger if you want to understand that one in more detail. So Schopenhauer, 200 years ago, or getting on for that, was saying that the world is a representation. We don't actually really know what the world is. All we know is how it is represented to us through our senses in the main. So the world is will and representation. So what's the will part of it? Well, there are some striking similarities between Schopenhauer and Spinoza in actual fact. Spinoza said the essence of man is desire. So we're driven by desire. For Schopenhauer, we're driven by will. And in fact, we are will. And so there are two aspects to our existence. One is that we perceive the so-called external world, although this external world is actually a creation on our part by our brains or our minds. So we perceive the world as representation, but also we are will. We are the objectification of will. We are will manifest. And for Schopenhauer, this will is totally blind, unconscionable, and has no, how can I put it, has no understanding of its objectifications. It just does it. It's a bit like gravity. Gravity is the cause of black holes, galaxies, solar systems, all the cosmic ordering and manifestations of matter, and the will is the same thing. It is the thing that manifests, particularly through living creatures, and creates and motivates their actions. And the fact that every creature believes it is the center of the universe means that all creatures will effectively use and abuse other creatures to manifest their own power. Hence the cause of endless suffering. And it may be that this will is in a sense flawed, because in man it kind of finds a turning point. And in fact the culmination of all Schopenhauer's philosophy is that of the doctrine of the denial of the will to life. He calls this will the will to life. And man can turn around on it and look at it and say, well, this will to life is just a blind, unconscionable thing and causes endless suffering, and I deny it. And as Schopenhauer says, this is essentially what the Christian and the Buddhist traditions are about in reality. Christ on the cross, Buddha saying that, essentially we're born, we suffer, we grow old and we die. And so Schopenhauer's view of the whole thing is traditionally called pessimistic. Personally, I don't find it pessimistic, and you'll find many people who comment on Schopenhauer, both below relevant YouTube videos or wherever the comments are allowed, will say that they find great comfort in Schopenhauer. And they find great comfort in him because they know that really he's telling the truth. He's telling it as it is. So you couldn't have more opposed views of the whole thing. Spinoza weaves his story about the wonder and the magnificence and power of God and how God is perfect, which is a meaningless statement because there is only one existence. So what do you compare it with to say it's perfect? Anyway, he says those things. Schopenhauer, on the other hand, says that we are just part of this force of will manifesting, and this force is unconscionable, it is impartial, and really doesn't care the least about all the suffering that it creates. And as such, it is Schopenhauer's view that the denial of this will to life is ultimately the action that man will take as he becomes more conscious and more aware. And that denial is throughout much of the traditional spiritual and religious traditions. And so he's not saying something really that is new, he's just framing it in a new way. So, from my point of view, from Spinoza, I take part 2 and part 3 of his ethics. Maybe I'll come to understand part 4 better. But for me at the moment, part 4 is wholly confused. Part 2 is about the liberation of the mind. Part 3 is about liberation of the emotions. Part 4 is this whole thing about reason, but to me it seems totally unnecessary and ancillary. So I then come to Schopenhauer, and what do I take from Schopenhauer? Well, what I take from Schopenhauer is that ultimately within us we can deny the will to life. It's a matter of an attitude. It doesn't mean that you become depressed or unhappy or anything like that. Quite the opposite, actually. It's just an acknowledgement within us that we are, in some kind of sense, superior to the very thing that has brought us into being. Whether that's by accident or by design, I really don't know. So, there's a saying by Don Juan in the books by Castaneda that choose a way, choose any way, but make sure that it is a way with a heart. Spinoza's work, in my opinion, is not a way with a heart. Schopenhauer's work, in my opinion, is a way with a heart. Having said that, though, I'm happy to take what Spinoza offers that is useful to me, part 2 and 3 of his ethics. But it's Schopenhauer that fashions my deeper emotional understanding of life, and for that I'm grateful.